Well, now on Sunday evenings for some time now, we've been looking at those days in which Elisha lived. And last time we looked at the reign of Jehu over Israel, which lasted for 28 years. He was a mixture of good and bad. On the one hand, he'd obeyed God in slaying Ahab's family. He was therefore rewarded by that, by his descendants being promised the throne for many years to come. On the other hand, he'd held on to the golden calves, which were idols, and therefore the Lord cut Israel short as their enemies won several battles against them. Meanwhile, in Judah, in the south of the country, Athaliah, the wicked daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, had slain all the royal children in order to become queen herself. But one child was rescued, a little prince called Joash, and he was hidden away in the house of the Lord. For 6 years Athaliah ruled wickedly, but then in the 7th year Jehoiada the priest gathered the leaders together and showed them the young prince, and they plotted to overthrow the evil queen. And when little Joash was crowned, they celebrated with clapping. Verse 13 of chapter 11 tells us that when Athaliah heard this noise, she went down to the temple to see what was going on, and thereby she hastened her judgment as other evildoers had done before her. It shows how few real friends that she must have had, because nobody had told her what was going on. And fancy not sending a servant to see what the commotion was about. But you see, when God decides to judge somebody, he allows their sanity to depart from them. They really do stupid things. When Athaliah reached the temple, she saw the young prince standing by the pillar where she normally stood, and she realised at once that this was a bid to take over the throne. Moreover, all the people showed their love for Joash. They all rejoiced, and trumpets were sounded, and Athaliah tore her clothes and cried out, "Treason, treason," claiming that they were all traitors. Jewish history tells us that she demanded that the boy be put to death. But it is common for those who are evil to feel that it's other people who are evil. It was Athaliah who'd committed treason. She'd murdered those little royal children. She'd usurped the throne that belonged to somebody else, but she has the nerve to call other people traitors. But such is always the way with evildoers. They criticise others for sins which are so glaringly obvious in their own lives. The sins which are biggest in their lives are often the sins which they so much get upset about in other people's lives. Athaliah complained bitterly at the wrong that she felt was being done to her, yet she forgot all the wrongs that she'd done against others. But then that had been 6 or 7 years ago. Surely that couldn't be held against her now. Oh yes, it could. You see, God doesn't forget the evils perpetrated in years gone by. Every single transgression has been recorded down and must reap its consequences. There are many, many sins which people have committed in the past which they've now forgotten about. Never think about it. But God still remembers. Old people did certain wrongs when they were young, which they've long since blotted out of their mind. But unless those sins are truly repented over and the blood of Christ applied to them, those wrongs will have to be accounted for when they die. Athaliah had been so very wicked in killing little children, yet she felt that people were being bad to her. She had no sense of the judgment that she deserved at all. And that would be true about most of the people who are sent to hell. They will feel that it's unjust, that they haven't been that bad, and they really ought to be treated in a different way. It reminds me of the occasion, I don't know if you remember it, when King Agag, who had murdered a lot of people, was brought to judgment, and he said to Samuel, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." In other words, don't be so angry as to put me to death. There's no need. We've had enough of all this killing. But Samuel said to him, "As thy sword has made women childless, so shall thy mother be childless." And then it says that Samuel hewed Agag in pieces before the Lord. So there was another murderer who didn't feel he deserved to die. And there are murders like that today. Now in verse 16, Jehoiada gave orders for Athaliah to be taken out of the temple and then be put to death, along with anybody else who stood up for her. But she must not be slain in the temple, because that was the house of the Lord, and that should be reverenced at all times. It appears that Athaliah tried to run away out of the back of the temple where the horses were kept. Just like you would have a car park today outside a church, so they had a horse park, as it were, by the side of the temple. But she was soon caught, and once again she who lived by the sword died by the sword. It's interesting that Athaliah died beside the horses, because that's what happened to her mother. Do you remember? She was thrown down from several stories up and crashed on the ground, and then the horses trampled over her. Thus, two of the most evil women in history met a similar fate. Anyway, all the opposition was now over, and the little boy became king, and the godly Jehoiada made sure in verse 17 that his reign had a good start. He made the people covenant before God and before one another, that from now on they would be the Lord's people and serve him. Too much sorrow and evil had been reaped through idolatry and forsaking the Lord. All that Jehoiada did, he did for the Lord. He was a very godly man, and he wanted the people around him to be the Lord's people. And by God's grace, most of us listening here this evening are the Lord's people. How wonderful that is. By the love of God, we have been eternally saved through the death of Christ on Calvary's cross. We are the Lord's people. Jehoiada was concerned that now the nation was at the start of a new era, they must also start afresh with God. And the young king must seek God for himself. And as he grew up, he must influence the people to go God's way. The people in turn should do all they could to seek the Lord and to help their new king to reign in righteousness. By the king and the people both joining themselves to the Lord, they would be joining themselves to one another. When people become true Christians and they join themselves to the Lord Jesus, they also join themselves to the Lord's people. We can also see here that whenever there's a special change in somebody's circumstances, that is a time for rededicating themselves to the Lord's service. It is good to be able to say, Lord, I don't know what this change is going to bring to my life, but what I do know is that I want to live for you and your glory, whatever the changes bring. Now, the first thing that was done in the reign of Joash was the destruction of Baal worship in verse 18. It says that the people went to the house of Baal and smashed it up with all their idols. You remember, of course, that Jehu had recently done the same thing in Israel in the north, and now it was the turn of Judah in the south to do away with the worship of Baal there. It says that they broke the images in pieces thoroughly. Notice that word thoroughly. So never again could they be put together. It's good in a person's life when they are determined to be rid of their idols thoroughly and make a complete end of them. We're also told that the people slew a man called Matan, who was the priest of Baal. He was in charge of the worship of Baal, and he was slain before the altars of Baal. Jehoiada then appointed officers over the house of the Lord to look after it and to influence people to attend it. And then he had little Joash brought down to the palace, and he sat him upon the throne so that all could see him. And the land rejoiced, and Jerusalem was blessed and enjoyed tranquility once again. This was a change for good in every way. Well, now chapter 12 opens up with the general information regarding the reign of Joash. And the first thing we see is that he was born in the same year when Jehu became king of Israel in the north. So that when Joash became king at the age of 7, Jehu had already reigned for 7 years. We're also told that Joash reigned for 40 years altogether. And all this shows the perfect timing of God, because many of the kings in Israel reigned for 40 years, not 39, not 41, but exactly 40 years, which shows the sovereign hand of God in it all. Now, verse 2, most important verse before us tonight, basically sums up the whole life of Joash, and therefore we have to look at it in detail. He did well in all the years while he had godly Jehoiada to instruct him, both in the ways of God and how to govern the country. A lot of young men who find themselves in an important position early in life resent the advice of older men. They think that they can make it on their own. But it wasn't like that with Joash at this time. He knew that he owed his life to Jehoiada, never mind the throne. So he also knew that he could depend upon all that Jehoiada advised him to do. But these words, he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord all the days when Jehoiada was the priest instructing him, have more relevance than we might realise. Although we're not told about it here in the book of Kings, the book of Chronicles tells us that when at length Jehoiada died, Joash became quite different. In fact, he became rotten. Instead of keeping to the old man's guidance and the instructions which he'd given him, he began to take advice from young, ungodly men that he knew, and he departed from the Lord. It was rather like Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. His wise father died, and he was left with a mighty fortune, a great estate. But he took bad advice from the young men that he knew, instead of going by the good advice from the old men that had known his father, and the result was that he lost most of his kingdom within a very short time. When Jehoiada's son, Zechariah, who later took over from his father and was also a priest, rebuked Joash and his friends, the result was that Joash had him murdered. In fact, it says that he murdered the other sons of Jehoiada as well. There are some things in life you can scarcely believe, but we believe these things because they're in the Bible. But this seems utterly incredible, doesn't it? That Joash, who'd been brought up by Jehoiada, and whose life had been saved by Jehoiada's wife, and who must have known Jehoiada's sons when he was young, and probably enjoyed playing with them, doing things with them, should then turn out to be their murderer. Joash owed Jehoiada everything that he had, and it doesn't appear to be long after the old man died that this dreadful thing happened. And as Zechariah, Jehoiada's son, was being stoned to death, he called out the words, "The Lord look upon it and require it." And that's exactly what happened. God wasn't going to let such a terrible thing go unpunished. And that's why when Joash was only 47, his own servants murdered him. Even in his last days, he had great diseases, according to the book of Chronicles. What a tragedy for this young man who started off so well and who'd been saved by the young princess, but who later grew up to kill the sons of that princess. Apart from what happened to Christ, does the Bible tell us of a more unthankful deed than that of Joash? So here's yet another person in the Bible who we have to find a way in that folder which is marked a good start and a bad finish. However, in this case, we're actually told the reason why he turned out so bad. It was because he depended too much on a man of God. He was all right while Jehoiada was around, but when he was taken away, Joash went to pieces. And how wrong that was. And the message of that must be clear to us all. Don't lean on other people, stand for the Lord. Stand up for Christ on your own 2 feet and don't lean on somebody else. And then you won't fall away when they've gone. Make sure that you've got your own personal walk with Christ, and make sure you're not in the Christian life because of friendship. You should be able to keep going for the Lord, even if your Christian friends departed from you, and even if older Christians who you may have depended upon are taken away by death. I suppose the most solemn warning in all this is that the sons and daughters of Christian families who do well in the Christian life all the days of their Christian parents, when those Christian parents are taken away from them, they must make sure that their Christian life doesn't break up and they finish up doing bad things. Now, as I say, you don't read any of that in the book of Kings. That's all in Chronicles. But it does come out of these words in verse 2 here, where it says that Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord while Jehoiada the priest instructed him. This 12th chapter deals with the events which took place in those days before Jehoiada died and while Joash was still doing well. In the main, everything was fine, except verse 3 says the high places were not taken away. These were private altars used for sacrifice, although it was done towards the Lord. So it's a mixture of good and bad. They worshipped the right God, but in the wrong way. They were rather like high churches today. They were probably allowed by Jehoiada in the hope that now the nation had turned back to the true God, people would gradually pack up this sort of worship by their own choice. He probably felt that the best way to get people to drop that which is second rate was to give them that which was first rate. And because of this, he did what he could to repair the temple of the Lord. Now, Solomon had made this temple out of the very best materials about 150 years before this, but nothing material lasts forever, not even Solomon's temple. Change and decay in all around I see. Verse 5 says that there were now breaches in the temple. So part of the wall had caved in, and the roof and the floors and the ceilings and the windows were all in a bad way. Because the nation had drifted away from God in the previous years, their leaders had not bothered to repair the temple. And things had gone from bad to worse, as anything does that's neglected. There's always an obligation on the people of God to keep the Lord's premises in good repair. The material upkeep of a church building may not be the most spectacular part of God's service, but it's still vital. But material things cost money, and repairs done at God's house cost money, and the repairs done in the great temple which Solomon had built would cost a lot of money. And getting people to part with their money has never been an easy thing. It needs somebody who's got their heart in it to do this. And during the days of Jehoiada, that's very important, during the days of Jehoiada, King Joash did have his heart in this. He never forgot that the temple had been in his place of refuge for 6 years. He owed it more than life itself. So he decided to raise money towards its repair. The money that a person gives to a church will usually be in proportion as to how much they love it and to how much they feel they derive benefit from it. Joash told the priests at the temple to arrange for the collection of the money. And from what it says in verse 4, this would come in 3 different ways. First of all, it would come from those who passed the accounts. So this was money that was actually owed to the temple by a sort of taxation that every Jewish person had to pay. Now, we saw that this morning, didn't we, about the money changers. Secondly, it was the money which people were obliged to pay who used the temple. Like today, if you were to use an Anglican church, a big church for a wedding, you'd have to give a donation towards it. So that's what used to happen with the temple. And of course, especially those people were going to use it to make personal sacrifices. Then thirdly, there was the money given as a free will gift from people, and all the money was then collected together and it was used to start repairing God's house. The end of verse 4 speaks of the money that came into any man's heart to give to God's house. And that shows that giving money to God starts in a person's heart. And it comes to a person's heart, it says. As if God gives people the desire, he puts the desire into their hearts, and then they put their hands into their pockets. Anyway, the work of collecting the money began, but it wasn't very successful to begin with. And a long time went by, and still the temple remained in a bad state. So when Joash was 30 years old and had been king for 23 years, he called Jehoiada and the other priests together and asked them why things were going so slowly. It seems that some of the money collected had been used for other things. Maybe the king was even suspicious that the priests were using some of it for themselves. And so Joash told the priests not to collect any more money themselves. It must be done by somebody else in some other way. And they consented to do this. And they agreed that other men be put in charge of the repairs of the temple, and this would free them from any appearance of grabbing money for themselves. Far better to let other people handle the material side of God's work. And so a very large chest was obtained, and the money that had been collected already was put inside it, and then a hole was bored in the lid, and then it was left in a place beside the altar of the temple, so that anyone wishing to donate could put their money into God's treasury directly. Well, this method worked, and people gave in abundance, and the result was that the chest was soon full up. And the high priest and the king's scribe, who was the chancellor of the exchequer, counted up all the money and put it into bags. 2 of them are needed so as to check on each other, as it were, and the 2 is the number of witness. The money was then given to those who had the charge of repairing the temple, who in turn hired builders and carpenters, who then got on and did the work. Stonemasons were also hired, and of course the materials to be used, the stone and the timber, were also purchased. Verse 13 states that the money was not to be used to buy equipment for use inside the temple, especially that which was mainly for ornament. The money was given to the workmen so as to repair and maintain the actual building. When it comes to spending money, priority must always be given to that which is essential. Practical needs must have the ascendancy over ornamental needs. However, Chronicles tells us that when all this repairing of the building was completed, because there was still money left over, so some of that was used to obtain plate for use within the temple. Verse 15 tells us that the workmen were so honest that those in charge didn't bother to ask them for any bills. They trusted them. These workmen appear to have loved the house of God themselves. They dealt faithfully, it says. In other words, they were not only strictly honest, but they put their backs into the work. And Christians at their place of work are to deal faithfully. They must not cheat their employers out of time or property. And the same goes for our work for the Lord. We are to deal faithfully so that people can trust us, and we won't make false excuses for not doing what we should be doing. And needless to say, the greatest criticism that's been laid against the whole Church of Christ over the years of time is that it's financially crooked. And that's that the churches are only after people's money, and some churches are after people's money. Therefore, it's extremely important that any money that is entrusted to a church is used in the correct way and not misappropriated. Verse 16 states that the giving of all this money did not affect the wages of the priests. They still got their maintenance, which came from the trespass money and the sin money. The priests would not have to go without while the other work was being done. They were not to lose out under the pretext that other things were more important. Now, the saddest thing of all this is that it would appear that Joash loved God's house a great deal without loving God himself. It's as if it was God's house that saved him when he was a boy, not God himself. And of course, there are a lot of people like that today. Some even spend their holidays visiting old church buildings, and they actually put their hands into their pockets for the restoration and maintenance of such places. But they've got no interest in the God of the Bible, and they're not trusting in the Lord Jesus Christ for salvation. They just like old buildings. Now, the remaining verses of this chapter, from verse 17 onwards, deal with the last years of the reign of Joash, after Jehoiada had died, and Jehoiada's sons had been murdered. Needless to say, God's wrath came upon Joash for what he'd done. He'd been so zealous in repairing God's house when he was about 30, but he turned quite godless by his late 30s, as many has done. Something about the 30s in somebody's life. They can start off very keen for the Lord in their early 30s, and by the end of it, they've gone. So once again, the Lord took his restraining hand off the enemies of his people, and Judah came under attack. Hazael, the king of Syria, who'd done so much damage to Israel in the north, now marched his troops onto Jerusalem in the south. And in order to save the bloodshed, Joash asked for terms of peace, and these were granted, although at a high price. All the hallowed things obtained by the previous kings were given to Hazael, to give him, together with all the gold out of the Lord's treasury and the gold out of the palace. Hence the Lord's treasury, which Joash had helped to build up earlier in his life, he now caused to be plundered. And he also lost his own riches and was made weak in every way. So once again we see the truth that the blessing of the Lord it maketh rich, but departure from the Lord it maketh poor. Christians who are well off and perhaps have a good income must never put this down to their own cleverness, nor to the affluence of the days in which they live. It's the Lord who maketh rich, and the Lord who maketh poor. Now, having paid Hazael so much in order for him not to attack Jerusalem, Chronicles tells us that Hazael came back the next year with the same threat. You can never pay a blackmailer off for good. Hazael, having got the money so easily before, he thought he could do the same again. Now, soon after he'd been made poor, Joash then became sick, and after a long time of illness and disease, 2 of his servants conspired against him. They weren't trying to get his throne. In fact, they allowed his son Amaziah to become the next king, but they hated Joash for what he'd done to the land in bringing it so low. For them, they thought it was an act of revenge. It was wrong of them, but God allowed it to further his own purposes against Joash for his having murdered the priests. It shows that even those who've done a lot of good for God's work and been interested in their church in their early days may still lose out later on if they depart from him or harm his representatives. Seeing so many people in the Bible losing out by going away from God, it should make us resolve to be different. Having begun in the Spirit, let's not end in the flesh. Let's not be amongst those who had a good start and a bad finish. May God forgive us our many sins and help us to remain faithful to him all our days, no matter who is taken away from us. Amen.
Amen.